All right, continuing on. We are going to be doing Chapter 6, Module 20. Uh, all right, let's get started. Okay, so this one's about community ecology. So after reading and listening to this module, you should be able to identify species interactions that cause negative effects on one or both species, discuss species interactions that can cause neutral or positive effects on both species, and explain the role of keystone species. All right. So this is all about within an ecosystem, those interactions between different species within an ecosystem, within a population or a community. So this is all falls under the umbrella of community ecology, which is the study of interactions between species. Throughout the world, species have symbiotic relationships. And a symbiotic relationship, if you've ever heard that term before, this is what it means. It's a relationship between two species that live in a close association with each other. Now, there are different ways. This can be positive, it can be negative, it can be neutral. So we classify those based on that. We've got negative species interactions, though, that include competition, predation, parasitism, and herbivory. So, what's competition? Competition is the struggle of individuals to obtain a shared limiting resource. So, this would be like food. Again, I like to use food as a resource. So, there's food, a certain amount of food in an area, whether it be a plant or a different animal. The different species in that area will compete, and one species probably will outcompete another species. This gets to the competitive exclusion principle. The principle, competitive exclusion principle, is the principle that states that two species competing at the same for the same limiting resource cannot coexist. So if they're competing, there's not enough resource for the both of them. They cannot coexist. So when two species have the same realized niche, they need the same things. One species will outcompete the other and drive the other to extinction. You can see this with a classic experiment by Gauss. He grew two species of paramecium separately, and both of them achieved large population sizes. Just imagine this being in a petri dish. So he grew both of these in their own petri dish, and as you can see, the Aurelia grew up to about 200. All right. And I don't even know how to say that. The second one grew to about 150. So they both grew fairly well in there. However, when they were placed in the same petri dish, instead of them both thriving, the Aurelia thrived to a point, now still not as good as the as it did alone, which is very important to remember. But the other one, the caudatum, eventually died out. So this is an example of competition. They both needed the same resources. They both needed the same amount of food that he was putting in the petri dishes, and then they could not coexist. But think about this, though. Not only did the Aurelia didn't win, basically outcompeted. However, it was negatively impacted because it still did not grow to the same level that it had without the competition being in there. Competition also includes resource partitioning. So this is where one doesn't die off. They do end up sharing a resource, but one will still outcompete another, depending on if there is, they'll divide a resource based on differences in their behavior and morphology. So when the evolution of resource partitioning is when two species overlap in their use of a limiting resource. Selection favors those individuals of each species whose use of the resource overlaps the least with that of the other species. So over many generations, two species can evolve to reduce their overlap, thereby partitioning their use of a limiting resource. So let's say there's, if you look at the graph on your left, the species one is a strong competitor, species two is a weak competitor, species one in the blue, species two in the yellow. And let's just say that they're birds. And here's the number of individuals on the y-axis and then the seed size on the x-axis. So at the beginning, they would both, whatever adaptations or whatever's in their species, maybe beak size, classic Darwin finch. You've got species one eating the smaller seeds and species two eating the larger seeds, but they both eat certain amounts of them eat the medium-sized seeds. What will happen is that since species one somehow is a stronger competitor, not sure why, could be some kind of adaptation, could be that they survive a little bit better with something that happens there. If they are the stronger competitor, eventually over time, you're going to see species one with a slightly larger population of species two, where species two does not eat any of that was previously shared. Usually this is what will happen in competition. The next type of negative interaction is predation. Predation is an interaction where one animal, the predator, typically kills and consumes another animal. Parasites are also a part of this. It's a specialized type of predator that lays eggs inside of another organism, and that organism is referred to as its host. To avoid being eaten or harmed by predators, many prey species have evolved defenses against their predators. You can think of like a porcupine with the quills on its back. All kinds of things. Plants, of course, that are poisonous, they evolve defenses. And it's not like they just grow them because the predator's there. It's these are the ones that genetically survive, will have those defense mechanisms built in. Parasitism, like I said before, is an interaction where one organism lives in or on another organism. A specific type of this is called a pathogen, and that's a parasite that actually causes diseases in its host. And a single parasite rarely causes the death of its host, but multiple could. Herbivory is an interaction where an animal consumes a producer. When herbivores become abundant, they can have dramatic effects on producers, especially if they overconsume them at a higher rate than they're growing back. So many species of producers have evolved defenses against herbivores to ensure their survival. Now, there are some that don't have negative interactions. So other species interactions can cause neutral or positive effects on one or both species. One's called mutualism. This is where you have basically two species increasing the chances of survival or reproduction for both species. So this is where you have a positive effect from these two living together. You can think of the shark and the remora fish, and you've got the shark that basically gets its body cleaned by this fish that eats all the algae that grows on the back of it, and the fish gets the food. You've also got commensalism. A commensalism is a relationship between species in which one species benefits and the other species is neither harmed nor helped. You could think of this as being like a clownfish and an anemone. Did I say that right? An anemone. Okay. So this could be, the clownfish and an anemone, where the clownfish has a place to live. The anemone isn't really helped much at all. It might be a little bit, but really, it's not. But the anemone provides protection from other fish to the clownfish. And so you can see here a breakdown of which is negative and which is positive. Competition, like we saw before, does have negative consequences for both species, even the stronger competitor. Predation is positive for the predator, negative for the prey. Parasitism is positive for the parasite, negative for the host. Herbivory is positive for the consumer and negative for the producer. Mutualism is positive for both species, where commensalism is positive for one and then neutral for the other. It doesn't affect it. There are special types of species called keystone species, and they have large effects on communities. Keystone species, they're not very abundant, but they have a large effect on the community. And if they're removed from the community, that entire food web tends to collapse. So it's a keystone species is a species that plays a far more important in its community than its relative abundance might suggest. A classic example of a keystone species is going to be the starfish. Um, uh, Research out of California. They removed starfish from many ecosystems just to see what would happen. Total collapse of the ecosystem because even though there weren't a ton of starfish, they were there cleaning um, basically algae and different. Cleaning the corals and rocks out there, and then when they were removed, those the algae was able to grow exponentially, and it caused the collapse of the ecosystem. And the ecosystem engineer is a keystone species, a specific type of one that creates or maintains habitat for other species. The classic example of that being the beaver, who actually goes and takes wood, makes their own dam, which stops river flow. So that can have negative consequences on other species in there. But what that does is it creates a lake ecosystem, and they do it for them, but it has positive effects on other species that need still water or need a water source. So that's it for Module 20 and from Chapter 6.